Imagine standing on a hill in 1683. Below you, Vienna, the heart of Europe, burns under siege. 140,000 Ottoman troops press closer, their cannons shaking the walls, their banners filling the horizon. The city is starving. Hope is fading, yet against all odds, just 80,000 Crusaders will march to its rescue and turn the tide of history forever. The siege of Vienna began in the hot summer of July 1683, when the armies of the Ottoman Empire moved west with overwhelming force. For decades, the Ottomans had pushed further into Europe, their banners advancing across the Balkans, their armies testing the strength of kingdoms and empires along the frontier. Now, Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha set his eyes on Vienna, the jewel of Central Europe, the very heart of the Holy Roman Empire. With 140,000 soldiers at his command, he believed the city would be his. Vienna, though proud and fortified, was unprepared for such a massive onslaught. Its garrison numbered barely 15,000 men. These were professional soldiers, local militia, and desperate citizens pressed into service. They were brave, but they were few. Behind the city walls, families trembled, knowing that the Ottomans were famed not only for their discipline but also for the ferocity of their sieges. When the Ottoman army encamped around Vienna, it was a sight that must have shaken the soul. Vast rows of tents stretched across the fields, colorful banners fluttered, and cannon batteries were rolled into position. At night, the glow of their campfires lit up the horizon like a second city. The Ottomans came prepared for a long siege, bringing supplies, artillery, and tens of thousands of men trained to grind a city into submission. From the very first days, the defenders felt the crushing weight of being surrounded. Cannon fire echoed daily, pounding against the walls, shaking buildings, and tearing through defenses. The ground beneath the city became a battlefield of its own, as Ottoman sappers tunneled under the fortifications, packing explosives to blast open breaches. Each explosion brought new fear, new damage, and the desperate rush of defenders scrambling to repair what had been destroyed. Inside the city, conditions grew worse by the week. Food became scarce, bread was rationed, and even the wealthy struggled to find enough to eat. Wells were strained, disease spread quickly, and the stench of death clung to the streets. Every day, citizens asked the same question: when would help arrive? Could Vienna last long enough? Yet, even under this crushing pressure, the defenders of Vienna held firm. Their commander, Count Ernst Rüdiger von Starhemberg, refused to surrender, though the odds were against him. He rallied his men with promises that help would come, even when he knew relief was still uncertain. For the people of Vienna, survival became an act of defiance. For Kara Mustafa Pasha, each passing day seemed to bring him closer to triumph. He was confident the city would soon crumble. Vienna's walls were cracking. Its people were starving. The siege, in his mind, was all but won, but history would prove him wrong. As Vienna's walls groaned under the weight of Ottoman artillery, messengers rode through Europe carrying desperate pleas for aid. The Holy Roman Emperor, Leopold I, had already fled the city, seeking safety in Passau. He knew that if Vienna fell, the gateway to Central Europe would stand open, and the Ottomans could march unhindered into the heartlands of Germany. The call for help was sent far and wide. Some rulers hesitated. Old rivalries, religious divides, and political suspicion weighed heavily. But the urgency of the moment forced a choice: either unite or watch Europe collapse. Among the first to respond was the Polish king, Jan III Sobieski. A seasoned commander, Sobieski understood both the danger and the opportunity. If Vienna fell, Poland itself might be threatened next. If it stood, Christendom could breathe again. Sobieski promised aid, but it was no easy task. Gathering an army across fractured lands required diplomacy, persuasion, and sheer determination. Piece by piece, a coalition began to take shape. From the Holy Roman Empire came imperial forces, led by Charles of Lorraine. German states contributed troops: Bavarian, Saxon, Franconian, each contingent small but vital. And at the heart of this alliance marched Sobieski's Polish army, hardened veterans who had fought countless battles against the Ottomans on the frontier. All told, the coalition numbered about 80,000 men. Against the Ottomans' 140,000, it was a daring gamble. Yet numbers alone do not decide wars. Sobieski and his allies knew that discipline, terrain, and timing could tip the balance. Still, the risk was immense. A failed relief attempt could mean not just Vienna's destruction, but the collapse of the entire alliance. The march to Vienna tested them at every step. The coalition moved across difficult terrain, Mountain passes, rivers swollen with summer rains, forests stretching for miles. Supply lines strained, men went hungry. Horses faltered under heavy loads. Yet they pressed on, driven by urgency. Vienna was running out of time. News from the city grew darker. Reports told of walls crumbling, of food reduced to scraps, of defenders exhausted after weeks of endless bombardment. Each messenger who reached Sobieski made it clear. The city could not hold much longer. The coalition army gathered near the Danube, their banners rising together for the first time. Different languages, different traditions, different commanders, but one goal. They marched as a single force, bound not by friendship but by survival. The shadow of the Ottoman camp lay just ahead. For the people of Vienna, hope flickered faintly. Rumors spread that an army was coming, though no one knew if it would arrive in time. Inside the besieged city, each hour felt like an eternity. On the hills beyond, Sobieski's men pressed forward step by step toward the decisive moment. The rescue of Vienna had begun. By early September 1683, the coalition army finally stood within sight of Vienna. From the wooded slopes of the Kahlenberg Hill, King Jan III Sobieski and his commanders looked down upon a terrifying scene. Below them stretched the vast Ottoman encampment, a sea of tents and banners stretching for miles, glinting in the morning sun. The city itself smoldered under constant bombardment, its walls scarred and broken, smoke curling into the sky. For those who stood on the ridge, it was clear. Vienna was on the edge of collapse. Sobieski studied the terrain carefully. The Ottomans had spread their army across valleys and ridges, with their strongest forces facing the city. The sheer size of their camp was overwhelming. An empire's might gathered in one place. Yet Sobieski saw both the danger and the opportunity. From the high ground, the coalition held an advantage. If they struck hard and coordinated well, they could drive through the Ottoman lines before Kara Mustafa realized the full scale of the attack. The coalition's forces spread into position. On the left wing, imperial troops under Charles of Lorraine prepared to engage the Ottomans closest to the city walls. In the center, German contingents from Bavaria, Saxony, and Franconia readied their ranks. On the right wing, Sobieski placed his Polish troops, including his elite cavalry, the Winged Hussars, waiting for the decisive moment. At dawn on September 12th, the battle began. The coalition advanced cautiously at first, muskets and cannons firing into the thick Ottoman ranks. Clouds of gunpowder smoke rolled across the fields, choking men and horses alike. The Ottomans countered fiercely. Janissaries, the elite soldiers of the empire, rushed forward with disciplined volleys, while cavalry units swept through the valleys, trying to break the advancing lines. The fighting was brutal and relentless. Every inch of ground was contested. Coalition infantry fought uphill battles, pushing through trenches and barricades built during the siege. The Ottomans resisted fiercely, determined not to surrender the ground they had spent 2 months holding. Inside Vienna, the defenders, realizing help had arrived, gathered their strength and struck out against the besiegers from within the walls. Exhausted, half-starved, and wounded, they nevertheless surged with new courage. For the first time in weeks, hope pulsed through the battered city. By midday, the battle stretched across a wide front. Cannon blasts shook the hills, musket fire rattled endlessly, and cries of men and horses mingled in chaos. Still, the Ottomans held firm, their sheer numbers keeping the coalition from a quick breakthrough. But Sobieski was patient. He knew the moment would come when the enemy lines grew thin and weary, and when that moment arrived, he would unleash a force unlike any other on the battlefield. The fate of Vienna, and perhaps of Europe, now rested on the edge of decision. As the sun climbed higher on September 12, 1683, the battlefield shook with chaos. For hours, the coalition army pressed forward, step by step, trading volleys of musket fire and clashing with Ottoman defenders in trenches, earthworks, and fortified lines. The struggle was fierce, and for a time it seemed neither side could gain the advantage. The Ottomans had every reason to believe victory was still within their grasp. Their numbers dwarfed. Vienna, battered and starving, surely could not hold out much longer. Yet while the Ottomans fought, Jan III Sobieski watched. From the slopes of the Kahlenberg, the Polish king studied the flow of battle with the eye of a seasoned commander. He knew that a single decisive strike delivered at the right moment could turn the tide. By mid-afternoon, the Ottomans were stretched thin. They had committed heavy forces to resist the coalition infantry on the left and center. The defenders of Vienna, desperate but determined, also poured out of the gates to strike the besiegers from behind. For the first time, cracks began to show in the Ottoman line. Sobieski knew the hour had come. He gave the order that would echo through history: the charge of the cavalry. At his command, 18,000 horsemen assembled on the slopes, the largest cavalry charge ever recorded. At the forefront were the legendary Polish Winged Hussars, armored riders whose tall wooden frames carried great feathered wings arching above their backs. When they charged, the air itself seemed to roar. The cavalry lined up in disciplined ranks. Sunlight flashed off lances, helmets, and steel. Horses stamped and snorted, sensing the storm about to break. Hussars lowered their lances. Sobieski himself rode at the head, resolute and fearless. Then came the signal. With a thunderous roar, the cavalry surged forward, hooves pounding the earth like rolling thunder. Down the slopes they came, gathering speed with every stride. The wings on their backs rattled in the wind, creating a sound that terrified enemies long before impact. The Ottoman defenders braced, but the sight was overwhelming. An avalanche of men and horses bearing down with unstoppable momentum. The first lines shattered on contact, crushed beneath steel and fury. The hussars carved through the camp, their lances breaking, their sabers flashing, their momentum unstoppable. The charge rolled like a tidal wave. Infantry scattered. Cavalry fled. Panic spread through the Ottoman ranks, spreading faster than fire. What had been a stalemate only moments before turned suddenly into collapse. In less than an hour, the balance of the battle shifted forever. The largest cavalry charge in history had broken the might of an empire. The Ottoman lines buckled, then broke. What had been a proud, disciplined host of more than 100,000 men dissolved into chaos as Sobieski's cavalry tore through their camp. Drums beat frantically, officers shouted commands, but fear drowned their voices. Once the hussars crashed into the heart of the Ottoman defenses, no amount of discipline could restore order. Kara Mustafa Pasha had staked everything on the siege of Vienna. For 2 months he had invested the city, building trenches, mining walls, and battering gates. Victory had seemed certain. Now in a single afternoon his grand design collapsed before his eyes. The cavalry charge was not the only blow. From inside the city, Vienna's defenders launched their own desperate assault, pushing back weakened Ottoman forces who no longer had the strength to resist. Coalition infantry pressed from the flanks, seizing abandoned cannon and turning them on the very army that had placed them there. What had been a coordinated siege became a trap closing from every side. Ottoman soldiers tried to regroup, but the pressure was relentless. The Polish Winged Hussars pursued them through camp and trench, cutting down those who resisted and scattering the rest. Horses trampled supplies, fires broke out, and the once proud Ottoman encampment, a city of tents and banners, was thrown into complete disorder. Many soldiers fled toward the Danube, abandoning weapons, armor, and comrades in their haste. Others tried to stand and fight, only to be overwhelmed by wave after wave of coalition troops. The great Ottoman artillery pieces, once the pride of the army, were seized or destroyed. The trenches that had nearly brought down Vienna became death traps as men stumbled over their own defenses, pursued by riders who gave no quarter. The scale of the defeat was staggering. In less than a day, an army that had threatened all of Central Europe was shattered. Coalition losses were significant, but nothing compared to the devastation suffered by the Ottomans. Thousands lay dead or captured, while the survivors fled in disarray. Sobieski entered the Ottoman camp that evening, surveying the wreckage of what had once been one of the most formidable forces in the world. He is said to have stood before Kara Mustafa's abandoned pavilion, its silks and treasures left behind in the panic, and declared, "Venemus, videmus, Deus vicit." We came, we saw, God conquered. The victory was more than just a battle won. It was the breaking of an illusion, that the Ottoman advance into Europe was unstoppable. The coalition of Christian states, once divided, had proven that unity could triumph even against overwhelming odds. For Vienna, it was salvation. For Europe, it was a turning point. And for the Ottomans, it was the beginning of a long decline. Kara Mustafa's failure would cost him not only his reputation, but eventually his life, as the Sultan held him responsible for the catastrophe. As night fell over Vienna on September 12, 1683, the battlefield lay silent except for the groans of the wounded and the crackling of fires consuming the Ottoman camp. The Great Siege was over. What had begun as one of the most ambitious Ottoman campaigns in history had ended in catastrophe. undone by a single day of relentless assault and one thunderous cavalry charge. For the defenders of Vienna, the relief was overwhelming. After 2 months of starvation, bombardment, and fear, the citizens emerged from their battered walls to embrace their allies. Tears mingled with cheers as they realized the city had been spared from destruction. What might have been a massacre or enslavement had become instead a moment of salvation. Bells rang out across churches, echoing over ruined streets as if to announce to the world that Vienna still stood. Among the victors, triumph carried with it exhaustion. The Polish Winged Hussars, who had ridden at the forefront of glory, now rested their weary horses, their lances shattered, their bodies aching from the strain of combat. Coalition soldiers collapsed onto the ground, too tired to celebrate, their hands still blackened with gunpowder, their ears still ringing from cannon fire. Victory was theirs, but the cost had been heavy. For the Ottoman army, the night was one of despair. Survivors streamed away from the battlefield in disorganized masses, leaving behind weapons, supplies, and comrades. Once the most feared force in Europe, they now fled in humiliation. Kara Mustafa Pasha, the man who had promised triumph to the Sultan, found himself facing the unthinkable. Defeat on a scale that could not be hidden or excused. He had lost not just a battle, but the aura of Ottoman invincibility. The repercussions were immediate and far-reaching. News of the victory spread quickly across Europe, carried by messengers and letters. To many, it seemed as if divine providence had intervened. The siege of Vienna was no longer just a military struggle. It was framed as a battle for the soul of Europe. The coalition had proved that when kingdoms and peoples stood together, they could resist even the greatest threats. The balance of power shifted. Though the Ottomans would continue to fight for decades, their long advance into Europe had been broken. Vienna became the line they could not cross. In the years to come, Christian armies would push the frontier further back, reclaiming lands that had been lost for generations. The Battle of Vienna was remembered not only as a triumph, but as the turning of a tide. For Jan III Sobieski, the day secured his place in history. Riding at the head of the cavalry charge, he had delivered a blow so decisive it would be retold for centuries. To the people of Vienna, he was their savior. To his allies, he was the commander who had held the line against an empire. And so as dawn broke on the following day, Vienna stood scarred but unbroken, while the Ottomans retreated into shadow. The fate of Europe had been altered in just a few hours, by courage, unity, and the roar of hooves thundering down a hillside. History often remembers battles as lines on a map, dates in a book, or names etched in stone. But the Battle of Vienna in 1683 was something more. It was a moment when the fate of an entire continent balanced on the edge of collapse, and a coalition of weary, divided peoples found the strength to stand as one. The Ottomans came with overwhelming force, confident that no city could withstand their siege, no army could resist their might. And yet, they were met not only with swords and muskets, but with endurance, with unity, and with the unyielding will to survive. For the citizens of Vienna, this victory meant life instead of destruction. For Europe, it marked the beginning of a new chapter, proof that even the greatest power can falter when confronted by determination and resolve. And for the Ottomans, it was the start of a slow decline, a reminder that no empire, however vast, lasts forever. But perhaps the deeper lesson is not about empires rising or falling, but about the resilience of ordinary people, soldiers who fought despite exhaustion, citizens who endured hunger and fear, and leaders who risked everything at a moment of crisis. It is a reminder that history is shaped not just by weapons, but by courage, sacrifice, and the choices made in the darkest hours. And so when we look back on the thunder of hooves, the clash of armies,